George Harrison reveals the four people he loved the most. If you could sit across from George Harrison and ask him one question about love, I don't think he'd give you the answer most people expected. He lived surrounded by fame, musicians, friends, and millions of admirers, yet the people who mattered most were often the ones who knew him before or beyond the spotlight. And when I look at his life, four names keep coming back: John Lennon, Paul McCartney, Ravi Shankar, and Olivia Harrison. What makes this story interesting isn't simply who these people were. It's what each relationship gave George. Because George Harrison's life changed dramatically after the Beatles became famous. But underneath all of that, he was still searching for the same things most people search for: friendship, understanding, peace, and someone who could see the person underneath the public image. The first name is probably the one everyone expects: John Lennon. But I think people sometimes misunderstand what John meant to George. Before the screaming crowds, before stadiums, before the Beatles became almost impossible to escape, there were just young musicians trying to figure things out. George was younger than John. He was also quieter. John had a sharper personality. He could dominate a room without trying very hard. George was more reserved, watching, listening, absorbing everything. And yet that difference probably helped bring them together. They were both obsessed with music. American rock and roll fascinated them. Records were studied almost like textbooks. Guitar parts were picked apart. Songs were played again and again. And somewhere in those early years, something much bigger than a band began forming: a friendship. That part of their relationship is easy to forget because history eventually became so complicated. But before the arguments, the fame, the business problems, and everything that came later, John and George were simply two young men who loved music. I think that's the version of John George carried with him. Not just the celebrity. Not just the Beatle. John. The funny one. The unpredictable one. The friend who could say something completely ridiculous and make everyone laugh. And that's important because their relationship wasn't perfect. None of these relationships were. John could be difficult. George could be stubborn. The Beatles themselves were changing faster than four people could realistically handle. But disagreement doesn't automatically erase love. Sometimes it becomes part of it. And when John was killed in 1980, George was forced to confront something that fame cannot protect you from: loss. He had spent much of his adult life trying to understand spirituality, death, and the nature of existence. But losing John wasn't an idea. It was personal. And I think that's when old memories become especially powerful. You don't remember the press conferences. You remember the person. Then there was Paul McCartney. This relationship was different. Paul and George had grown together inside the same extraordinary musical machine. But George wasn't always treated like the equal creative force he eventually became. For years, he was the younger guitarist standing beside Lennon and McCartney. Imagine what that must have felt like. You know you're getting better. You know you have ideas. And yet you're standing beside two people who already occupy most of the creative space. That tension eventually surfaced. There were disagreements. There were frustrations. There were moments when George reportedly felt that his songs weren't receiving the attention he believed they deserved. But here's what I find fascinating. Despite all of that, Paul remained part of George's story. Because beneath the arguments was history. They had grown up together. They had played tiny clubs together. They had traveled together. They had watched the impossible happen together. Nobody else could fully understand what that experience felt like. Paul knew the young George. George knew the young Paul. And that's something fame can't recreate. You can meet thousands of people after becoming famous. But you can't go back and make new memories with the people who knew you before anyone cared who you were. That's why their relationship matters. Even when it became complicated, even when they disagreed, the history remained. And then George's life took a completely different turn. This is where Ravi Shankar enters the story. And honestly, this may have been one of the most important relationships George ever had. Because Ravi didn't simply introduce George to the sitar. He introduced him to a different way of thinking. By the mid-1960s, George was living inside something that looked like a dream from the outside. The Beatles were enormous. But enormous success has a strange side effect. You can become surrounded by people and still feel completely alone. Everyone wants something from you. Everyone recognizes your face. And almost nobody asks what is happening inside your head. Ravi Shankar was different. He was an established musician with a completely different cultural and spiritual perspective. George became deeply interested in Indian music and philosophy, and the relationship grew beyond music. That's the part I think matters most. Ravi became a teacher and eventually a close friend. George's curiosity about spirituality wasn't a passing fashion. It became part of how he understood life. He began looking beyond fame, beyond possessions, beyond the idea that success automatically creates happiness. And Ravi helped open that door. George would eventually say and do things that reflected a much deeper spiritual outlook than the young guitarist people had first seen in Liverpool. That transformation is one of the most remarkable parts of his story. The boy who once wanted to be a great guitarist became a man increasingly interested in what existence actually meant. And Ravi Shankar was a major part of that journey. But if John gave George friendship, Paul gave him shared history, and Ravi gave him a new way of seeing the world, there was one person who gave him something else: home. Olivia Harrison. By the time George met Olivia, he had already lived through an almost unbelievable amount. Beatlemania, world tours, recording sessions, spiritual exploration, marriage, the breakup of the greatest band in popular music, solo success, public pressure, and eventually, the realization that none of those things could provide what an ordinary life could. Olivia understood George in a way the outside world couldn't. She wasn't married to an idea of George Harrison. She was married to the man. And that distinction matters, because imagine spending decades being recognized everywhere you go. People know your songs. They know your face. They think they know your personality. But very few people actually know what you're like when the cameras disappear. Olivia did. Their life together had its own difficulties, of course. No relationship is perfect. But she became a central part of George's later life and remained beside him through some of its hardest moments. And that tells me something. When George's life became quieter, Olivia was still there. Not because she needed the spotlight, but because she shared his real life, the gardens, the home, the conversations, the ordinary days. And after everything George had experienced, ordinary probably became incredibly valuable. That's the strange thing about looking at a life as famous as his. We remember the spectacular moments, the Beatles, the records, the concerts, the guitars, but people rarely remember the quiet moments. And sometimes those are the moments that matter most. John Lennon represented the beginning. Paul McCartney represented the journey. Ravi Shankar represented George's transformation. And Olivia represented the life he built after the world had stopped chasing him. 4 very different people. 4 completely different relationships. And I think that's why this story feels bigger than simply asking who George Harrison loved. Because love isn't always one thing. Sometimes it's the friend who knew you when you were young. Sometimes it's the person who challenged you. Sometimes it's the teacher who changes the way you see existence. And sometimes it's the person who sits beside you when there is nothing left to prove. George Harrison spent years trying to move beyond the noise surrounding him. And perhaps that's the real irony. The world wanted more Beatles. George wanted something much quieter. Meaning, peace, connection. When he looked back, the biggest achievements of his life weren't necessarily the things millions of people saw. They were the people who stayed with him through the parts nobody